There are moments that the world never notices. No headline, no witness, no one marks them down in any record of human history. But inside the person living them, something shifts forever, like a bone that breaks quietly deep beneath the skin, where no one can see the damage but the one carrying it. This is one of those stories, and I need you to stay with me, because what happens to this woman, what she endures, what she becomes, it will reach something inside you that you forgot was still tender. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far the story has traveled, because some stories deserve to travel far. This one does. Her name was Eliza. Eliza Hale. She arrived in the mountain town of Red Creek on a Tuesday afternoon when the dust was thick and the sun was already thinking about leaving. The wagon that brought her had not been comfortable. The driver had not been kind. He was the sort of man who charged for every mile and smiled at nothing. And when he finally pulled the horses to a stop at the edge of Red Creek's only real street, he said simply, "Into the line," and waited with his palm out. She paid him every last coin she had brought for the journey. He took the money without looking at her face, clicked his tongue at the horses, and rolled away. He never looked back. Not once. Eliza stood there in the red dust with a small, worn suitcase at her feet and a folded letter pressed against her palm. The letter had promised her a position, work and lodging in a boarding house. The woman who had written it had used warm words, careful words, the kind of words that make a desperate person believe the world is about to open a door for them. She had believed it. Oh, how she had believed it. Because when you have nothing, a kind word feels like solid ground. She walked to the boarding house with her suitcase bumping against her leg, her boots raising small clouds of dust with every step. She could feel eyes on her from the porches, men leaning on railings, watching a stranger arrive the way people in small towns do, like you are either entertainment or a problem, and they haven't decided which yet. The boarding house door had a paper nailed to it, closed for repairs. No date given. She stood there for a long moment, reading those 3 words again and again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. As if somewhere in the grain of that old wood door, there might be an answer she had missed. There wasn't. She turned and looked at Red Creek. Really looked at it. A blacksmith somewhere out of sight. The ring of iron on iron. A dog sleeping under a wagon like the heat had defeated it completely. Wooden storefronts with paint so faded you could barely read the signs. And people, enough people to fill the street, not one of whom moved toward her. Her stomach made a sound she was glad no one heard. She had not eaten since dawn. The general store stood near the center of town. The windows held sacks of flour and tins of sugar like museum pieces behind glass. The sign above read, Hollis & Sons, Goods and Supplies. She pressed her lips together, lifted her chin the way her mother had taught her to do when the world felt too large and too cold, and she walked toward it. The bell above the door rang sharp when she stepped inside. 3 men stood near the counter. They turned together, slowly, the way men do when they've been standing in the same place, so long that any movement is interesting. Behind the register stood the owner. He was a wide, ruddy-faced man named Mr. Hollis. Thick in the middle, sleeves rolled to the elbow, suspenders doing their best work. He looked her up and down in one long, unhurried sweep. Her faded dress, the careful patch at her elbow, the dust on her hem that no amount of brushing had fully removed. Something shifted in his expression, not sympathy, something closer to amusement. "Well, now," he said, loud enough that every ear in the store could catch it easily. Another hopeful came riding in on the afternoon wagon. A chuckle from a man by the counter. Eliza stepped forward. She set her suitcase down by her feet, gently, the way you set down something you're afraid of losing, even though the suitcase held almost nothing. 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a photograph of her parents on their porch back in Tennessee, her mother's hand on her father's arm, both of them squinting into the sun and smiling anyway. "I'm looking for work," she said. Her voice was soft, but it did not shake. Or, if work isn't possible today, I would be grateful for a little flour and salt. I can repay you once I find employment. The laughter came quicker this time. Mr. Hollis leaned forward on the counter, squinting at her like she was a poorly labeled jar of something he couldn't quite identify. "Repay me with what, exactly?" he asked, spreading his hands wide, playing to his audience. "Promises and good intentions?" The men by the window grinned at each other. Eliza reached into her pocket. Her fingers found the cool, familiar curve of metal she had been hoping not to use. She drew out a small silver locket. It was her mother's, worn smooth by years of handling, the metal soft with memory. She set it on the counter carefully, like it deserved to be placed rather than dropped. "This," she said quietly, "until I can repay you properly." Mr. Hollis picked it up, turned it in his thick fingers, held it to the light with exaggerated interest, the way a man does when he's building something. Then he dropped it back on the wooden counter with a hard clink that made her flinch. "Sweetheart," he said, grinning wide, "that little thing wouldn't buy you a biscuit. Might not even buy you the smell of one." The store erupted, laughter filling every corner, bouncing off the tin ceiling, filling the space between the flour sacks and the pickle barrel, and Eliza stood in the middle of it, holding the edge of that counter, because her hands needed something solid to hold on to, and she thought, she will not cry. She will not cry. She absolutely will not cry in front of these men who do not know what she has carried to get here or what it cost her to walk through that door. Her mother had worn that locket every single day of her life. She reached for it, and then, from somewhere near the back of the store, came the sound of boots. Slow, deliberate, certain, the kind of footsteps that belong to someone who is in no hurry because they have already decided what they're going to do. A tall man stepped out of the shadow near the stacked feed sacks. He wore a dark hat pulled low over steady gray eyes. His coat was worn but clean. The dust on his boots spoke of long roads and early mornings. He moved through that store like someone who had spent enough time alone in the mountains to be completely unbothered by the noise of other people's smallness. He did not look at Mr. Hollis. He did not look at the men who were still smiling. He looked only at Eliza. And something about the steadiness of that gaze made the laughter begin to die, the way laughter does when it suddenly realizes it has an audience of one person who is not entertained. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather pouch, untied it with unhurried fingers, and let several silver coins fall onto the counter. The sound of them hitting the wood was the only sound in the store. "Give her what she asked for," he said. Low, calm, but carrying the way mountain air carries things farther than you expect. Mr. Hollis's smile didn't disappear all at once. It dimmed. "Now hold on, Callum," he began. "I didn't ask for your thoughts," the man replied, in the same even tone. "Flour, salt, some dried meat." The shopkeeper's jaw moved for a moment without producing words. Then he reached for a sack. Eliza stood completely still, her pulse loud in her own ears, the silver coins sitting on the counter between her and this stranger like something she didn't yet know how to name. "I can't accept," she began. "You can," the man said quietly, still not looking at her directly. "And you will." The men in that store shifted. No one laughed. Outside, he walked ahead of her into the afternoon light. A horse waited at the hitching post, dark and patient, like it had been waiting its whole life and had made its peace with it. He turned to her for the first time, up close. His eyes were gray, not cold, just clear. "You got somewhere to stay?" "No," she said. He studied her face for a moment, the way a person looks when they are measuring something deeper than words. "Then you do now," he said. "Cabin's a mile up the ridge. Fair work. Fair pay. The garden needs bringing back." She looked back at the general store one last time. Through the glass, she could see Mr. Hollis watching, his expression unreadable now, the smile completely gone. She turned back to the horse, to the mountain, to this quiet stranger who had spent his own silver coins on a woman he had never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. And in a town full of people, he appeared to be the only one who understood that. Eliza Hale picked up her suitcase and stepped forward. She had no idea yet what this mountain was about to give her. And she had no idea that Red Creek was about to learn something about dignity it had long since forgotten. Stay with me, because what happens next on that ridge, in that cabin, in that garden she brings back from the dead with her bare hands, it will make your heart ache in the best possible way. You don't want to miss part 2. The road up the ridge was narrow, carved into the mountainside like a wound that had healed but left its mark. Pine trees lined both sides, their branches reaching across the path like they were trying to hold hands overhead. Red Creek disappeared behind them slowly. The horse moved steadily upward. Eliza walked beside it first, her hand resting light on the saddle strap, her suitcase switching from one hand to the other whenever an arm grew tired. The man, Callum, walked ahead, leading the horse with the loose, easy grip of someone who has done this 10,000 times and long ago stopped thinking about it. He did not fill the silence with words. He just let it be, and she was so tired of words, of promises written in warm ink that turned cold the moment you arrived to collect them, that the silence felt like water to someone who had been thirsty for a very long time. After a while, her legs began to ache. Not politely, deeply. He noticed the way quiet people notice things, without making any fuss about it. "Ride," he said. She wanted to refuse. She almost did, but her legs made the decision before her pride could. He lifted her onto the saddle with both hands, careful and firm, the kind of carefulness that comes from someone who has handled fragile things and learned, through loss, not to grip too hard. He walked the rest of the way beside the horse, one hand on the rein, guiding them up the final slope as the sun slipped lower behind the peaks and painted the pine trees in the color of something almost holy. The cabin appeared as the last real light of the day touched it. It was small, pine logs weathered gray by seasons that had not been gentle, a stone chimney breathing thin smoke into the cooling air, a split-rail fence around a patch of land that had once been tended and was now going wild at the edges. Firewood stacked against the wall, enough to last, neatly split, the work of long, solitary mornings. Everything about the place said, someone lives here who does not expect company, but does expect hard weather. Eliza climbed down slowly. Her boots touched the packed earth, and for a moment she simply stood, looking at it. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and something older, pine and solitude and time. A sturdy table near the hearth. 2 chairs. A cast-iron stove in the corner, clean and black. A narrow doorway leading to a small room beyond. No decoration except a single photograph on the mantel. A woman. Young. Dark-haired. Smiling. The kind of smile that fills a room even when the room is a photograph and the person is gone. Eliza looked at it for only a moment, but he saw her looking. "My sister," he said. Quiet, simple. 5 winters back. "I'm sorry," Eliza said. He didn't answer. He moved to the stove and built the fire up without ceremony. She did not ask more. She understood the specific silence of a loss that has been carried so long it has become part of the landscape of a person, part of how they move through a room, part of why a man who could live anywhere chooses a ridge a mile above a town that doesn't really know him. He pointed to the narrow doorway. "Room in there. Bed simple but solid." "What kind of work?" she asked. "Garden needs to be brought back. Fences gaps. I sell dried herbs in town twice a month." He paused. "If you know how to grow anything." Eliza, he thought of her mother's hands. Brown from the sun, patient, moving through the garden, rose the way some people move through prayer. "I know enough," she said. He nodded once. "Good." That night she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the wind move against the cabin walls, pressing at the logs the way something does when it wants in but hasn't found the crack yet. She was safe. She had food. She had a roof. She could hear the fire settling in the main room, the soft collapse of embers, and she stared at the ceiling and let herself feel, finally, what she had been holding back all day, all the way from that wagon, all the way from that letter, all the way from the last place that had promised her something it did not intend to deliver. She did not cry loudly, but she wept, quietly, into the pillow, the kind of crying that is mostly relief, mostly the body letting go of something it has been clenching for so long that it forgot it was clenching. By morning, she was already outside before the sun fully arrived. The garden was worse in the daylight than it had seemed the evening before. Weeds are thick and purposeful, the kind that grow with a determination that almost earns respect. Soil cracked on top, but dark and alive underneath when she pressed her fingers through crust. Stone borders are still in place. Good bones. That was what her mother always said about a neglected garden. As long as the bones are good. She worked until her back arched in the specific, satisfying way that only real labor produces. She hauled water from the well in heavy buckets that left red lines across her palms. She pulled weeds until her fingers bled a little around the nails, and she kept going. She spoke quietly to the struggling Rosemary the way her mother had taught her, low and steady, because her mother believed, without apology, that plants could hear encouragement and chose to respond to it. Callum watched from a distance at first. He never hovered, never corrected, never offered the kind of help that is really just criticism with good manners. He just watched, and sometimes, when she glanced up, he had already gone back to whatever he was doing, as if he had only stopped to confirm something he already suspected. I want to ask you something right now, while this story is sitting with you. Have you ever worked so hard at something not because anyone was watching, but simply because it needed doing? Because you were the one there, and it was in front of you, and something in you refused to let it die? Drop the word roots in the comments if that's you. Because what Eliza was doing in that garden, it wasn't really about herbs. It was about refusing to be what that store full of men had decided she was. Stay with me. Days passed, then weeks. The garden began to change. First as hints, a tinge of green where gray had been. Small shoots pushing through like questions being asked carefully. Then chamomile buds, small and golden and unreasonably brave. Then rosemary standing tall and fragrant along the south edge. And mint spreading enthusiastically along the shaded side of the fence as if it had simply been waiting for permission. And Eliza changed too, though she didn't see it the way a person outside her could see it. Her hands grew rough. Her arms grew strong. The set of her shoulders shifted the way it does when a person stops bracing for the next blow and starts simply standing in their own space. In the evenings, they sat at the small table near the hearth. Mostly quiet, but not the uncomfortable kind of quiet. The kind that settles around people who have decided they don't need to perform for each other. One evening, Callum spoke without looking up from the table. "You didn't deserve that," he said. "In the store." She was quiet for a moment. "Neither did you," she said. He looked up. "What makes you say that?" "No one chooses to live a mile above a town unless something was taken from them," she said gently. "And they needed the distance." He didn't answer, but the next morning, she found a small jar of salve beside her bed. For the cracks on her hands. No note. Nothing said about it. She held it for a long moment before opening it. And she wept again, just a little. Not from sadness this time. From the unexpected grace of being cared for by someone who asked for nothing in return. Keep going, because part 3 is where everything they've built faces its first real test. And it comes without warning, the way the hardest things always do. 2 months after Eliza Hale arrived on that ridge with nothing but a worn suitcase and a locket and whatever quiet determination was keeping her upright, the garden was alive. Genuinely, beautifully, stubbornly alive. Chamomile flowers dotted the beds like small, scattered suns. Rosemary stood proud and deeply fragrant along the south row. Mint had claimed its territory along the fence with the confidence of something that has never been told it couldn't. Lavender, which she had started from 2 sorry little cuttings she'd found half-buried near the fence post, had spread into a soft purple ribbon along the eastern edge. It was market day. Eliza stood in the cabin doorway that morning, brushing the dust from her skirt. Same faded dress, but it hung differently now, not because the dress had changed, but because the person wearing it had. Her hair was pinned back neatly. Her hands, rough and capable, moved over the fabric with quiet confidence. Callum was loading bundles of dried herbs into the wagon, working steadily and without ceremony the way he did everything. He looked at her across the yard. "You ready?" She took a breath that went all the way down. Yes. The ride down to Red Creek felt completely different from the ride up. All those weeks ago, when she had been a woman the town had already laughed at, sitting on a horse she had been lifted onto by a stranger's kindness, carrying nothing but the residue of humiliation and the thin warmth of unexpected mercy. She sat straight in the wagon now. She watched the trees give way to the town's edge with open eyes. The market square was alive when they arrived. women moving between stalls with purpose, children chasing each other between wagon wheels with the total commitment that only children bring to running. The smell of bread and wood smoke and something sweet from somewhere deeper in the square. They set up their table near the water trough. Eliza arranged the herbs with care. Each bundle tied with twine, the knots neat and firm. Small labels written in clear, steady script with the names and uses of each plant, because she had learned from her mother that people trust what they can read. At first, the crowd moved past. Then an older woman slowed. She picked up a bundle of rosemary, turned it in her hands, and brought it to her nose. Her eyebrows went up. "Well," she said, loud enough that the nearby stalls could hear, "that is the strongest, cleanest rosemary I have smelled since I don't know when." Someone else stepped closer. "How much?" A woman with a basket and a practical expression. Eliza named the price clearly, without apology, without softening it down into something timid. Coins began to arrive on the table. More people gathered. Then more. The crowd thickened in the way that crowds do when something genuine is happening and they want to be part of it. Eliza moved through it all with a calm she felt in her chest, like a stone that had finally been set down in exactly the right place. And then she saw him, Mr. Hollis, standing near the entrance to his store with his arms folded and his expression tight, watching her table, watching the coins arrive, watching the crowd grow. He began to walk toward her. Her hands paused on the twine. Before he reached the table, Callum stepped forward. He did not move aggressively. He did not cross his arms, or set his jaw, or do any of the things that signal confrontation. He simply stepped to stand beside her. Steady, quiet, present. Mr. Hollis stopped. He looked at the herbs, at the table, at the line of women waiting with their coins already out. Something moved across his face that might have been many things: embarrassment, maybe, or the particular discomfort of a man who is realizing, in public, that his judgment was wrong. He swallowed. "Looks like you found your flower after all," he muttered. Eliza looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said, "I did. Nothing else." No triumph in her voice. No bitterness. Just the clean, simple fact of it. Mr. Hollis nodded once, tight and awkward, and walked back toward his store. Eliza exhaled, slow and even. Callum glanced at her sideways, and in his eyes was something she had not seen there before. No pity, not protection, respect. That evening they rode back up the ridge with an empty wagon and a pouch of coins that was heavy and warm against her palm. The sun was going down behind the peaks in long orange and purple stripes. The air smelled of pine and the cooling earth. Eliza sat in the wagon and felt something she had almost forgotten the taste of. Peace. Not loud, not dramatic, just deep and true in hers. But the mountain, as Callum had once told her, without words, simply by the way he watched the weather, the mountain was not finished with him yet. 3 days later, the storm arrived. It came from the high peaks without any of the usual warnings the sky gives when it's building to something. Just a sudden darkening, clouds folding over each other, and then the wind, sharp and cold, bending the pines until they'd grown from somewhere deep in their roots. Eliza was tying back the mint when the first flash of lightning split the ridge like a crack in a wall. Inside, Callum called from the fence line. They barely made the cabin door before the sky released everything it had been carrying. Rain struck the roof like it had a grievance. Water began rushing down the slope in rivulets that quickly became streams that carved new paths through the dirt. Eliza stood at the window, watching the garden take it. The chamomile bent nearly flat. The rosemary trembled. Along the lower beds, she could already see water pooling, pressing against the stone borders, finding the weak places. "Flood will take the lower beds," she said. Callum stood beside her, watching. "It always does." She turned to look at him. "Then we move the stones." He stared at her. "In this?" "Yes." She was already reaching for a shawl. "Before it's too late." He started to say something. She was already out the door. The rain hit her like a wall, immediate and absolute, cold and driving and completely indifferent to whether she was ready for it. Mud took her boots to the ankle in the first 3 steps. Her dress was soaked through before she reached the lower beds. She knelt in the running water and began dragging stones from the border, repositioning them, building a barrier along the path the water was choosing, redirecting it, reasoning with the flood the way her mother had once told her you could reason with a river if you knew where it wanted to go. Callum came out. He cursed under his breath once, quietly, but he came. They worked without a word between them. Lightning overhead, water rushing cold around their ankles. Her hands slipped on the wet stone. His broader hands fit the larger rocks into place. The chamomile bed was second from going completely when a last stone locked into position and the water hit the barrier and split, running around instead of through. She sat back on her heels in the mud and rain, breathing hard, water streaming down her face. He stood over her, soaked to the bone, looking at the barrier they had built. "You don't back down from much," he said. She looked up at him, rain on her lashes. "I've already lost too much to let rain decide anything for me." The storm spent another hour against the mountain before it passed. By morning, the sky was the deep, apologetic blue that follows a night of violence. The garden was wet, but standing. The chamomile had straightened itself back toward the light with a resilience that made her throat tight. She walked the rows slowly, checking everything with her hands. She smiled. Behind her, Callum's voice was quiet. "You saved it. We saved it," she said. "Can I stop here for just a moment? Think about the storms in your own life. Not the weather kind. The kind that came at you with no warning and try to take the things you had worked hardest to build. Did someone stand in the rain beside you? Or did you do it alone? Type storm in the comments if you've been through something that tried to take everything. Because Eliza's story is about to take a turn that no one saw coming. And the person who shows up next on that ridge, it will break your heart and then quietly put it back together. Part 4 is where the most unexpected thing happens. Don't go anywhere. It was the afternoon of the day after the storm. The sky had gone back to behaving itself. The kind of clean, still afternoon that only comes after a night of extremes, as if the world is embarrassed about what it did and is trying to make it up to you. Eliza was working on the fence line, replacing a rail that the wind had torn loose when she heard it. Hoofbeats, slow and uneven, the sound of a wagon in trouble. She straightened and looked down the ridge. A wagon was struggling up the slope, leaning wrong, one wheel grinding against the road in a way that had the sound of something about to give up completely. A man walked beside it, one hand on the side of the wagon trying to keep the load balanced, limping slightly, his hat missing, his hair flattened by the previous night's rain. She knew who it was before she could fully see his face. Mr. Hollis. He looked nothing like the man who had stood behind his counter with his sleeves rolled up and his audience at the ready and his particular talent for public cruelty. He looked smaller, damp, diminished in the specific way that the road diminishes people when it has been unkind to them. The wheel gave out 20 feet from the cabin. It cracked and splintered, and the wagon listed hard to one side, the load shifting, and Mr. Hollis stumbled back and stood there looking at it the way a man looks at a disaster that feels, on some level, like it was waiting for him. Callum was moving before Eliza, quick and certain, down from where he'd been working on the roof overhang, reaching the wagon and assessing the damage with the practiced calm of someone who has fixed broken things on mountain roads before. Eliza followed. Mr. Hollis looked up. He saw Callum first, which was easier. Then he saw Eliza, and something moved across his face that was complicated and heavy and too slow to be comfortable to watch. He looked at the ruined wheel. He looked at the ground. He looked at the wagon. He looked anywhere for a long moment that was not directly at her face. "Bridge near town washed out," he said, addressing the wagon, mostly. "Lost half my supplies in the flood. Was trying to make it back before dark." He cleared his throat, took the upper road, which was how he had ended up here. On her road, at her cabin, he finally looked up at her, and there was nothing left in his expression that resembled the man who had dropped her mother's locket on a wooden counter like it was a joke. "Axle brace is cracked," Callum said, already moving toward the barn. "Won't make it down without fixing it." Mr. Hollis shifted. His hands moved to his coat, reaching inside. "I can pay," he said quickly. Too quickly, with the sharp edge of a man who is terrified of what it means if he doesn't. "I don't need charity." Eliza held those words in the air for a moment. She felt everything she had a right to feel. The memory of that store came back clearly, sharp as a bell, the laughter filling up every corner, the silver coins hitting the wood, the particular shame of standing in a room full of people who found your poverty entertaining. Her mother's locket dropped like a worthless thing. She felt it all, and then she stepped to the wagon and placed her hand on the broken wood. "Nobody said anything about charity," she said softly. "We fix things up here because they need fixing." Callum came back with tools and spare timber. He worked quickly and without drama, the way he did everything. Eliza held the wheels steady while he replaced the brace, her hands dirty again within the first minute, and she found she did not mind at all. Mr. Hollis stood to the side. At first he stood the way proud people stand when they're accepting help, stiff and slightly turn away, as if keeping part of themselves uninvolved somehow preserves their dignity. But then, gradually he began to help, passing tools, holding the lantern when the light faded behind the ridge and the work became harder to see, steadying the wagon body when Callum needed both hands free. Small things, but offered. When the wheel was secure and the wagon stood straight again, the three of them stood in the quiet of the mountain evening with the smell of pine and wet earth around them. Mr. Hollis cleared his throat. Once, twice. Then, in the tone of a man lifting something heavy he's been carrying for a long time and is finally, at last, setting down, he said, "I was wrong." The mountain wind moved through the trees. "About you," he continued, his voice rougher now. "About that locket. About the whole of it." He paused. "I've been wrong about a good many things." Eliza looked at him. She thought of all the things she could say. There were words available to her that would have been completely fair, completely earned, completely justifiable given what he had done and the audience he had done it in front of. She said none of them. "Get home before dark," she said gently. "The lower road should be passable now." Mr. Hollis nodded. He turned to the wagon, placed his hands on the seat, and paused. He turned back one final time. "You ever need anything from the store?" he began. She shook her head once. "I don't." He gave a short nod, the kind that holds more than words, and climbed up to the wagon seat. Click to the horse. The wagon rolled down the ridge, steady now, the repaired wheel holding true on the mountain road, getting smaller until the pines closed around it and it was gone. Eliza stood listening to the sound fade. Callum stepped beside her. "You could have let him struggle," he said. The evening air was cooling fast around them. The first stars were beginning to make themselves known above the ridge. "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that comes before something true. "Because I know what it feels like," she said, "to stand alone somewhere and need help and be afraid to ask and have no one give it to you anyway." She paused. "I didn't want to be someone who does that to another person, even him." Callum said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "You've got more mercy in you than this whole mountain deserves." She looked at him, this quiet man who had spent his coins on her in a store full of laughter, who had walked beside her horse up a dark road, who had left salve for her hands without a word, who had come out into a storm and moved stones beside her in the rain. "I learned it from someone," she said simply. He looked away quickly, back toward the mountain, but not before she saw his eyes. That night at the table, the fire was smaller and the evening was quieter than most. Eliza held the silver locket in both hands, running her thumb over the worn surface the way she had done 10,000 times, the metal soft with the memory of her mother's hands before hers. It had never been worthless. She had known that. But tonight, somehow, she felt it differently. Not as something that had survived other people's judgment, but as something that simply had always been, completely regardless of what anyone in any store had ever said about it. The locket was not valuable because someone finally recognized its worth. It has always been valuable. She had always been valuable. Hold that thought and come with me to the final part, because what happens in the last chapter of this story is quiet. It doesn't shout, but will reach inside your chest and stay there. Don't leave now. Autumn came to the ridge the way it comes to mountain places, not gradually, but decisively, as if the season has made up its mind and sees no reason to ease into it. One morning you wake, and the air has a different quality, clean and sharp, with something in it that reaches back and touches every autumn you have ever known. The garden impossibly, was more beautiful than it had been in summer. The chamomile had seeded itself generously along the borders, small golden buttons everywhere Eliza looked. The rosemary was deep and blue-green, so strong and fragrant that you could smell it from the cabin door when a morning wind was right. The lavender she had grown from those two sad cuttings months ago had spread into something remarkable along the eastern fence, a long, soft ribbon of purple that moved in the wind like a slow breath. She had done this. With these hands, these rough, capable, certain hands that had hauled water and pulled weeds and moved stones in the rain and pressed seeds into soil with the kind of faith that has no evidence, only the quiet insistence that things can grow if you tend them carefully enough. She stood in the garden one morning, just standing, not working, just present in it the way her mother had sometimes stood in the garden back home, simply to be surrounded by what had grown. And she understood that now. Why did her mother do that? Market day came again, and the third time was nothing like the first. The people of Red Creek had been coming to their table for weeks. There were regulars now, women who sought out Eliza specifically, who had opinions about her chamomile versus the chamomile from the Valley Farms, who asked her advice about their own kitchen gardens and received it genuinely and well. Children who ran to the herb table because Eliza always kept a small bundle of something sweet-smelling at the front that they were allowed to touch. She moved through the market with ease now. Her voice was clear. Her prices were fair. Her knowledge was real. And Callum stood nearby, not hovering, not guarding, just there, the way he had always been there since the moment he stepped out of the shadow of that feed sack, a quiet and constant and entirely reliable presence. Something had been growing between them, slowly, the way the best things grow, without announcement, without urgency, like the lavender along the fence that simply expanded into more of itself, day by day, until one morning you stood back and saw something genuinely beautiful where there had only been bare earth before. They had not spoken of it directly. They did not need to, not yet. But there were evenings at the table where the silence was different, softer, more carefully kept. Moments where a hand passed close to another hand, and neither moved away, and no one said anything about it. And the fire settled in the hearth, and the mountain wind pressed quietly against the walls, and the world outside felt very far away and not particularly important. One evening in that golden autumn light, Callum was sitting on the porch steps when she came out of the garden. He had something in his hands. She came closer and saw that it was the photograph from the mantel. His sister, the smiling woman with the dark hair. He held it the way you hold something you love and have also grieved, gently, with all of yourself in your hands. She sat down on the step beside him. He looked at the photograph for a long moment. She would have liked you, he said. Eliza felt that land in her chest. What was she like? He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding how much to give. Stubborn, he said finally. Never backed down from anything that needed doing. Grew half of this garden, actually, back when I first built the place. He paused. Then she got sick, and I stopped tending it. Didn't see much point for a while. Eliza looked out at the garden. The chamomile, the rosemary, the lavender. I'm glad it waited, she said softly. He looked at her, and the look on his face was something she had no name for, but that she felt throughout her entire body, warm and aching and absolutely certain at the same time. So am I, he said quietly. There's something I want to say to you here, right in the middle of this last chapter, because this is the moment where the story asks you something directly. Have you ever felt like Eliza in that store? Standing somewhere with something precious in your hands, and having someone look at you, and laugh? Have you ever left a place carrying a wound no one else could see? Have you found your ridge, your garden, your quiet space where you could finally grow something true? Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. Weeks passed, then a month, then two. The first frost came, delicate and white across the garden, and Eliza moved through it in the early morning, covering the plants that needed covering, leaving uncovered the ones that could take it, sage and lavender, and the hardier rosemary, which stood through frost the way certain people stand through hardship, not unchanged, but not broken either. She had written to her cousin back in Tennessee. A long letter, longer than she had intended, because once she started writing, there was so much more to say than she had realized. She told her about the cabin and the garden and the market days. She told her about Callum, carefully, in the particular language women use when they're telling the truth about someone without quite saying all of it directly. Her cousin wrote back with one line in the middle of a long and warm letter that made Eliza read it 3 times and then fold it very carefully and put it in her pocket. "You sound like yourself again." I didn't realize until reading this how long it had been. One morning, Callum came back from town with a wagon and something extra in the back. A small wooden box, carefully wrapped in cloth. He set on the table in front of her. Inside was a collection of seeds, organized, labeled, more varieties than she had ever grown. Things she had mentioned once in passing, weeks ago, not expecting him to remember. He had remembered. Every single one. She looked at the seeds, at the careful labels in his handwriting, at this man standing in the kitchen of his own cabin that had been silent and half-kept for years until she arrived, and she put her hand over her mouth because there were no other words available to her. "For next spring," he said simply. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she lowered her hand, there was something in her expression that she made no effort to conceal. And he saw it, and he did not look away. That evening they walked the garden together in the last of the autumn light. The chamomile had gone to seed, its stalks dry and pale and full by next year. The rosemary was clipping well. The lavender bent softly in the mountain wind. Their shoulders were close as they walked. Not touching, but close. The kind of close that is its own kind of conversation. She reached up and touched the silver locket resting at her collarbone. This small, warm oval of metal that had traveled with her from Tennessee to Red Creek, that had been set on a wooden counter and laughed at and retrieved, that had pressed against her heart every day of the hardest year of her life. She held it for a moment. Her mother had given it to her the morning she left home, had placed it around her neck with both hands the way you do something that deserves to be ceremonial, had said only, "You carry something with you that nobody can take. Don't let anybody tell you any different." She had almost forgotten that. She would not forget again. "You know what I think sometimes?" she said. Callum looked at her sideways. "I think the boarding house being locked was the best thing that ever happened to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. She had not seen him smile like that before. Full and real and with his whole face. It changed him completely and also confirmed everything she had already suspected about who he was beneath all that quiet. She laughed softly, and the sound of it moved out across the garden and up toward the mountain and disappeared somewhere into the great silence of the peaks. And it was the most natural sound in the world. The sun went down behind the ridge in long stripes of gold and rose. Their shadows stretched out ahead of them across the garden path, long and easy. The mountain stood above them the way it always had, ancient and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas it witnessed, and yet somehow that evening it felt almost like it was watching with something gentle in it. Eliza Hale had arrived in Red Creek with one worn suitcase, one folded letter full of empty promises, one silver locket, and the kind of quiet, stubborn, unbreakable dignity that no one had taught her to be ashamed of yet. She had stood in a room full of laughter and not shattered. She had climbed a ridge in fading light and started over. She had pressed her hands into dead soil and coaxed something living out of it. She had stood in a storm and moved stones. She had helped a man who had hurt her because she understood in her bones that passing pain along is not the same thing as putting it down. And she had found, in the most unlikely of places, in this weathered cabin a mile above a town that had dismissed her, something that looked very much like home. Not the home she had lost. A new one. Hers. There is something I want to leave you with. Some of us have been Eliza, standing somewhere with something precious in our hands while the room laughs, carrying things that others called worthless, arriving somewhere with less than we should have needed and being asked to make do. Some of us have been Mr. Hollis, not cruel by nature, maybe, but careless in it, laughing at the wrong moment, finding out later on a broken road in the rain what cost us. And some of us on the very best days have been Callum, watching quietly from somewhere in the back of the room, stepping forward when it mattered, spending what we had without requiring a return, building a silence around someone that was actually a kind of shelter. Whatever version of this story you're living right now, I want you to know one thing. The locket was never worthless. Neither were you. Not on the worst day, not in the hardest room, not when the loudest voices were certain of it. You have always been worth something true. Thank you for staying all the way to the end of this story. It means more than you know.